Hey guys, I'm Jeremy, and today I'll talk a little bit about Mexico and why I think you should go there. It's a really interesting place. I think as far as North America goes, it's probably the most interesting country in a lot of ways, and I'll explain why. And so in this video, I'll basically tell you what surprised me about Mexico, some of the safety issues, what would it be like to live there, and thoughts if you're going to do a motorcycle trip like I did, and a little bit about hiking. So a disclaimer, I didn't just do kind of the touristy thing. I didn't just go to Cancun and stay in a resort for a week. I flew into Mexico City, I rented a 250 motorcycle, went down to Pico de Orizaba to hike the highest peak in Mexico, which is 18,500 feet. And then I drove down to Oaxaca, indigenous town in the mountains there, which was amazing. And then I went through the mountains to go to Cordoba and then back to Mexico City. So my trip was kind of a little bit more off the beaten track, which I think is a good way to explore any country because you get to see kind of the real deal. And so first I'll talk about why Mexico is so much more different than the United States or Canada. And a lot of this gets down to demographics. The United States, and to a lesser extent Canada, when they came and they settled, they had huge immigration to the New World from Europe, and most of the indigenous people died from disease. And in Mexico, the Spanish didn't have a mass immigration policy from like Europe or from Spain. There was some people, and most of the population either survived or they had still a significant population, even to this day. Because I remember reading about the Mexican-American War, and they could have actually taken more land south of Texas, south of the Rio Grande River, but they didn't want it because they didn't want that huge population. And so Mexico's a much more like indigenous country. In places like Oaxaca, it's I think 75% like native, you know. So that's why Mexico has a much different feel than the United States or Canada, which is, you know, mostly European. And of course now that's changed in the last 40 years. So in that regard, it makes it much more interesting because it does have that Spanish and Christian influence, but it's mixed with a lot of the indigenous things too, like food and culture and religion and everything else. So some of the things that surprised me. So I think one thing that surprised me is that it wasn't quite as chaotic as I thought it would be. Like for instance, because there's a lot of this crime and things going on with the cartels and a lot of people have been kidnapped and crime and stuff, that gave me the sense that the country in general was like pretty chaotic and that rules weren't really followed or enforced, for instance. And as soon as I came into Mexico City, you know, I got to my friend's place and like, even the traffic wasn't that bad. It's one of the few like developing countries I've been to that didn't have like millions of motorcycles and scooters. I spent a lot of time in Asia over a decade, and like in Taiwan, in Southeast Asia, the Philippines, and a lot of other countries in the world, a lot of the cities are just motorcycles everywhere and scooters, which isn't a bad thing. It makes sense because people don't have a ton of money to buy a car or to store the car somewhere. And so I assume Mexico City would just be another crazy scooter kind of city, but it really wasn't that crowded off like the main roads. Though like the side roads and places were actually quite quiet and pretty mellow. So that was kind of a nice thing in a way. And as far as the rules go, like small things I noticed at the beginning, like if I try to park on the sidewalk, the guy mentioned you have to park on the road. You can't just park anywhere on a sidewalk like, you know, I might do in, you know, somewhere in Asia or something like that. You also can't drink with an open container. I just assumed it's like a big vacation place, and like most of the places I've been around the world, you could just drink anywhere. You know, you could walk to a park and drink. So actually in Mexico, you could get in trouble for doing that. So keep that in mind. There's no open container anywhere. I did a couple times. I was sitting in a park. I had a beer. But yeah, you could get in trouble for that. So be careful of that. And I'm not sure about every place, but you can't fly your drone anywhere. I did have a guy bust me for flying in Monte Alban, outside of Oaxaca, and that's actually the case everywhere around the world. Any touristy place, they don't want drones around. But yeah, a guy came up, and that was the only time I had to deal with any authorities, though. Any other time, the police and no one bothered me, at least. But it definitely seemed more orderly, and I would even say cleaner than I assumed. I mean, there's some dirt and things around. There's some poor areas, but even in the States, like you get poor areas are, you know, a mess or dirty. So it wasn't really that different than most places. I didn't really see too many homeless people or people begging or trying to push tours or anything too obnoxious. Like someone might ask or say something but go by, but they don't have the homeless issue like the States, for instance, or other developed countries. And I didn't notice people like ripping me off at all. I remember even the first couple days I was like, paying for water, small things, and seeing if they'd give me back the correct change. And I don't think anywhere I got ripped off, or if I did, it would have been really small. So at no point did I feel like there was any time where I got scammed or ripped off or anything like that, which obviously is nice. Now, of course, if you're in a resort town somewhere, I bet people get ripped off more, but that's the same anywhere, and most of my trip wasn't in a tourist area, so that makes sense. And everyone was really friendly. I never had any strange looks or any shady situations. I went to local bars, hung out, walked home at night, at 2 a.m. And I didn't feel like there was any situation where like I felt sketched out. Now, that doesn't mean you're totally safe. I mean, that obviously bad things could have happened, right, at any point, but I never experienced it. It does happen, but luckily for me, that wasn't an issue. Of course, the food's amazing. I mean, Mexico's one of the best in the world. I don't even know, really would be a lot better. I mean, I love China and India and other places, Thailand and stuff. But the thing is, even in China, when I lived there, like, it's best to share food with like a group of people because then you're trying 10 different foods. But you don't really, if you're alone, which is most of the case, you're just going to get noodles or dumplings, or they have buffets where you could get different food. But I don't always want to go to the buffet place, or they're not as good quality as like, when you share dishes. And that's kind of the same in India too. Like if you go to most of the stands, they only have 2 or 3 different things. Unless you go to like a regular restaurant and then you want to be with 2 or 3 people to share several different things. So in Mexico, yeah, you could just get like one little taco or 2 or 3 different tacos and kind of mix it up a bit. And I doubt that would really get too boring for me. And plus they have options for anything else. Like I got some ramen while I was there, and the whole world's globalized in that regard, which is good things. Like, for instance, I even thought the sandwiches were amazing because tortillas are nice, whether they're flour or corn, but you could get some awesome sandwiches that are mixed with the best Mexican food too. So I only scratched the surface on food, but like I don't think that would get old anytime soon. I think in the long run, that would be one of the biggest highlights. As far as safety goes, I checked out the State Department, the U.S. government site, and they're generally pretty paranoid about the whole world. Shouldn't go here, shouldn't do this. Like, I've been to Pakistan, they said you shouldn't go, or you shouldn't go to that country, this and that. But for Mexico, I figured, it was a short trip. I didn't want any issues. I didn't go to the red areas. I was like, I'll go to the yellow areas. There's still so much to see. That doesn't mean that you can't get robbed in a yellow zone or that every area that's red's bad, but that was a good guideline. I'd stick with something like that. And obviously the borders are probably a little more sketchier, not just in Mexico, but any country, the borders are kind of shady. I did meet one guy on one of the food tours I was on. He was from Canada. He was in Cancun and got robbed. He went into the wrong Uber, and the guy drove him a couple miles up the road just to be greeted by 4 other guys who were like, give us your stuff. They didn't pull out a gun or a knife, I don't think, but he assumed they had something if they wanted to. And plus it's 4 or 5 people against one dude. And so he got his passport and money and stuff stolen. He had to walk back to town a couple hours. That was in a tourist spot, and I think if you do want to target foreigners and you are making a plan, you're going to go where the tourists are, which are the resorts and stuff. I wasn't in any resort for the most part, except Oaxaca's a little touristy, but probably not quite as much as the resorts. And so to say that the resort is going to be safe, I don't know if that's true. I have seen quite a few people that were killed or got robbed in resorts as well, even if it was a 5-star resort. So I wouldn't kid yourself to say, oh, you're in this resort, this is fine, because, if people are thieves and they want to steal, they're not going to steal from a poor area. You're going to go where the money's at. So in general, you just need to be vigilant. And it's a little bit how you carry yourselves, because I've seen people that have been there with only a few hours and got robbed in Mexico. And I've seen people that lived there 2 decades and never had an issue. And some of the people, it's the clothes you wear. Some of the people have really nice clothes on and an expensive handbag and jewelry and gold chains. And the other dude who's been there a couple decades, is kind of scruffy. He trying to blend in with the locals, looks like he doesn't have any money, whether he does or not. I kind of looked a little scruffy on purpose. I look like I'm a dude without much money, And of course, there's a lot of homicides, there's a lot of kidnappings, and there's a lot of bad things happening between these cartels. Most of that's between themselves. The reason why they're attacking and fighting each other is over money. And these other cartels are trying to cut into their money or this or that. If you rob a tourist, like, you're only going to get a small amount of money, and you might have the FBI breathing down your neck and the Mexican authorities. So it's not worth it to rob a national from a different country when all of the people from their embassies will be applying pressure, and you're not getting like millions of dollars from that. You know, it's just, oh, I got like a gold chain or something. So I don't think the cartels are specifically doing this kind of thing. This would be more of petty theft and people who might even be somewhat affiliated. So yeah, just be careful. You know, I mean, like, I went home a couple nights late. Generally, I wouldn't advise that kind of thing. You know, don't hang out too much after dark, too late. Obviously, bad shit happens at 3, 4, 5 a.m. People are trashed, whether the foreigners are trashed or whether the locals. People start to do crazy things when they're super drunk or on drugs, right? So just keep that in mind. I think it's generally not so much more dangerous than anywhere else. I could be wrong on that, but like I said, I've seen people that have been there years and never had an issue, and other people have been there and within 24 hours robbed. So I think some people are just naive too. With that being said, you know, get the traveling insurance. Most of the traveling insurance, if you look into the details, a lot of money for medical and a little bit like if your baggage is lost, but they actually don't cover a lot of your, like, electronics, for instance. You know, they've got like a deductible for a few $100s, and they'll only give you $500 to like $1,000 at most. You can change the plans, but they're not good for theft very much. I did find that there are specific insurance companies that cover cameras and drones, but another idea I found that might have been a little simpler as far as trying to save time, not investigating too much time, is that there's homeowners insurance, which obviously protects your home. But I was surprised to learn that it covers you when you're traveling. So if your computer or some of your electronics get stolen while you're traveling, that actually is covered. And this plan I saw from Lemonade was only like $20 a month. And so that would cover my apartment if I get robbed while I'm gone, and it'll cover some of my electronics. It seems like it has good reviews. That's something I would consider. If someone's going to rob you and it's a matter of your life or death, let them get your stuff. You know, you'll get that $2,000 or $3,000 back. You might lose $500 or $1,000 or whatever, but it's not worth your life. So I wouldn't resist. A lot of the people I have seen that did get killed, they were resisting. They went, you know, some people were trying to pull them over. Let's say they're in a motorcycle or whatever kind of thing, or a car. They tried to drive away and they were killed. So I wouldn't resist. I would just give them your stuff and, you know, let it be. So overall, I think you definitely should travel to Mexico despite this kind of thing, because there's so many tens of millions of great people there that could totally use the money through tourism and restaurants and all this different stuff. So I wouldn't hold the negative 2 or 3% of people, whether in Mexico, America, or any country in the world, to prevent you from seeing the beautiful sides of a country. You know, you just got to stay vigilant and be smart. And I think you can have a wonderful experience. And quite frankly, I mean, there's a lot of shootings and issues in places like the States too, right? So, like, I go around Denver here, there's a lot of homeless and mental illness and problems. I don't feel safer in Denver than Mexico City. I mean, I might even make the argument that I felt safer in Mexico, sadly. But that's just the truth. So I'll go into what I think it would be like to live there. Now, have I stayed there like for several weeks or months? No, it was only a 9-day trip, but I've lived in China over 10 years, 3 years in Taiwan, 6 months in Nepal, a few months in Armenia. So I'm familiar with living abroad. I've traveled in other countries in Latin America and Africa and Middle East and all over the world. And I've also been teaching people in the evening, adults from Latin America. And of course, when I was in the military, I was from Latin America. So I'm familiar with the culture. And so I'll kind of mention some of the things that could be good or bad about that. So as far as if you're going to try to make money there, obviously you're not going to make much money, like teaching English, for instance. I think you're only going to make about $500 a month. So if you got the digital nomad thing down, like you're making good money online, go for it. Do keep in mind that there already has been a lot of digital nomads going down to places like Mexico City and kind of the expensive areas. And it has really infuriated the locals quite a bit because they're willing to pay any price for a place. And so it raises the rent for everyone else. So just be kind of mindful, just not to like throw away your money. When you do things like that, it kind of ruins it for other people. Like for instance, if you're a tourist and you go to a touristy area and you're like, a bottle of water is only 10 cents. Well, I'll just give you $1. Or I'll give you $5 and I'll give you some pens and I'll give you money. The next people who come along, they think you're just money bags and you want to spend a bunch of money. And then they'll actually feel like, well, that's weird. Why aren't you giving me a ton of money like these other people? You just must be like a stingy, bad person or something. And so I've seen some of the worst people around the world in these tourist areas, not because the local people are so bad, but because all of these tourists from like Europe and other countries are just handing out money like nothing. So just be mindful of that. But regardless, I'm sure there's plenty of places in Mexico that would be nice to live. Mexico City would have a lot more to do, but would be quite a bit more expensive. I'm not sure how much rent would be, probably closer to $1,000 like most places in the States, but you'd have a huge city with a lot to do. I think that would definitely be fun for a year or two. Oaxaca would be also a good place. It would be cheaper, nice in the mountains, good weather. It might, smaller cities may kind of get old after a few months or at least a year. But it could be like a great place that's cheaper to like learn Spanish, for instance, and maybe volunteer or teach a little bit and do some work online. I think that would be a nice spot. And then, of course, I'm sure the beaches and other areas, like I'm sure there's 20 or 30 other nice places in Mexico you could live. You'd have to research more on that. The cultural aspects, the pace of life was good. Like I said, Mexico City and the other places, it wasn't like too rushed. It didn't feel like New York City, but it didn't feel like super slow either. It was a good pace, a little slower in the smaller towns, but it wasn't too bad. It was a nice pace. The negative things about the culture I've noticed, and I don't want to say this specific to Mexico, so I'm generalizing here, kind of lumping all of Latin America together. Things like people being on time is not usually the case, which isn't too big of a deal. Like if I want to meet someone at a bar and I say 7, I could have a couple beers and we could meet up at, they could come at 7:38. I don't care, But some of the time it's a little annoying. Like if you are kind of on a schedule and it's kind of not really that much on time, and maybe a little more flakiness. I didn't have this in Mexico, but I remember when I was biking around South America, I was supposed to meet someone through couch surfing, and we were supposed to meet in the square, and I'm like, hey, what's up? I'm here. And it's like, oh, I wasn't sure if you'd come, so I didn't go. And there was like this back and forth quite a few times with, 2 or 3 people. And so a little bit of flakiness. And I teach adults at night now, and their concept of time, they don't mind being late and coming in late. A lot of talking in class, so it's a little bit more laid back. They like to enjoy their life more, so it's cool. And that's great, But just know it's definitely not on you're not in like Germany, Japan, or the States where things are on time quite a bit more. So with that being said, yeah, some of the services and businesses might not be as efficient or as good. I don't have a ton of experience in Mexico. The only thing I could say is that I did rent that motorbike, and they were great about the pickup and the drop off, but the communication with the girl was slow. Like, of course, I contacted them several weeks in advance. There should only be 2 or 3 correspondence where I'm like, this is kind of the bike I need. Let's send the contract and let me pay in advance. It was always 3 or 4 days on and off in between emails, and I wanted to pay before I went, so I make sure everything's set. And she didn't send me the contract until like the day before I got the motorcycle, which I could understand too, because some people might flake out, right? But I wanted to pay her in advance, and she would have even had my money in advance, so that could have been a benefit to them. And I tried to use my credit card to do it, and of course they thought it was fraud, and I couldn't get that to work through this, thing. It's called like Shoom, like through PayPal. And I had to use my debit card, and I didn't want them to hold the deposit for my bike on my debit card, for instance. And now that I'm back in the States, it's already been a week. They're supposed to give me the deposit back, and it hasn't happened yet. And it was supposed to be, they were supposed to give a certain amount back after like 3 days. And then if there was no traffic violations, like a few days later. Now she's telling me it's going to take longer, and some small issues with, my bag was on the back, and they're like, they might have to replace something. I'm like, I could see the hooks underneath might make markings, but there's nothing really broken there. So I hope they don't do any kind of scam. They were good overall, so I'm not too stressed. But yeah, the services and stuff, they could have got that stuff done a little quicker. And so anyway, no big deal. Just know that when you get in there that, yeah, it's not, the services and some of the standards aren't going to be the same. And the weather was great. Most people would assume Mexico would be hot everywhere, and I'm sure on the coast most of the year it's pretty hot, except for the winter it would cool down. Remember, the mountains in Mexico are super high, which is one of the reasons why I did this trip. I hiked up to the third highest mountain in North America, Pico de Orizaba, 18,500 feet, about 5,600 meters. And there's several other mountains like that around. And so even in the summer, I imagine those places are pretty cool. I was there mid-late November, and I was kind of cold on my motorcycle driving through the mountains there. So you can escape the heat if you want, even in the summer, I think, in a lot of these places. And like a place like Oaxaca is about a mile high, like Denver, warm in the day, cool at night. Mexico City is about 7,400 feet. So even higher than Denver. It would get a little hot in the day, but the evenings would be nice. So I think the weather actually in Mexico is probably better than you think. Pollution wasn't too bad in Mexico City considering how big it is. I did see quite a few areas in the countryside that were pretty polluted. I think a lot of factories might be near like the coast or other areas. I'm not sure exactly, but you could check online for you could check the pollution levels of every cities. Oaxaca seemed pretty good. So thoughts about if you're going to do a motorcycle trip, like I said, you can rent them in Mexico City, and there's a few other places on the coast. Any tourist area is going to have motorcycle rentals. Usually they're the bigger bikes. Most people don't want 250s like me, but I was on a budget. You get, 650s and big bikes for $100 a day or whatever. Your United States license should be fine. If you have a motorcycle license in the States, that should be okay. Now, do some people get shaken down by cops in certain areas? I think so. I've heard of it happen. It didn't happen to me. So no worries about that. You can ride on the highways with a 250 or above. So if you want to save time, you could head out on the highways, which is what I did coming and going from places like Mexico City. But obviously the smaller roads are much better anyway. So I took the little roads through the mountains. That was so much fun. And you don't have to pay for that. Those tolls weren't super cheap. I think going to Mexico City, it probably ended up costing me like $15-20 in a day. I'm not sure exactly, but not real expensive, but it's not just 10 or 20 cents. The traffic lights are pretty long. They must be about 90 seconds. I remember in Taipei they were long too, so you definitely be waiting there for a little bit. People generally go by the rules, but you will see some people go through the lights, which is probably why they have speed bumps everywhere. So not on the highways, of course, but the little towns and the secondary roads, you got to pay attention for those. Because, if you're going 100 and you hit those, you could lose control, which is a reason why I never encourage anyone to drive a motorcycle at night. You could even say for a car, but I went to hike that mountain, that highest mountain, and so obviously I wanted to leave super early, so I left around 5. It was still dark. I hit a couple of those in the dark and a couple potholes too. The roads were generally good, but yeah, you got to be careful in the dark. Wouldn't recommend that in general. But yeah, it's speed bump country. There's speed bumps in all those towns and stuff. So a little annoying, but no big deal. I don't think you legally could go right on red. I did occasionally. You might get a ticket for it. So maybe check the rules on that. But overall, good riding. And there's not many motorcycles out there on the roads. It's mostly like trucks and cars. And as I mentioned, you have great hiking opportunities. I hiked up to the highest mountain, but there's 6 or 7 other big peaks up there. Most of those were volcanoes at one point. I generally think of Mexico as, more of people going to the coast, but I think you've got great hiking opportunities there. Super fun for motorcycles. The cost wasn't bad. I think for my motorcycle each day, I was spending something like, $20 or something. And hotels were probably around $35, $40, and most of those meals were like $4. Of course, could be more or less depending on where you go, but definitely very affordable. I'm not sure what cost of living would be in Oaxaca or some of the smaller places, but I'd imagine you could find stuff for like $400 or $500 a month. That would be pretty decent. Maybe not right in the most touristy or right in the center of the city, but something a little outside. So anyway, I think you should definitely check out Mexico. I thought it was an amazing trip. It exceeded my expectations. It's a lot more interesting in many ways than the States or Canada, because you have the old history from the Spanish from a few hundred years ago, and even before that you have the different pyramids from the Aztecs and other civilizations down there that are thousands of years old. Whereas in the United States and Canada, you've got Boston or Montreal is probably a little more interesting, and a few other cities here or there are neat. but you don't have a lot of indigenous structures and things. Like, there's a little bit in Mesa Verde, like the cliff dwellings I've been to out in western Colorado, and a few other things. But culturally speaking, you don't have a very significant amount like you have in Mexico. And plus the food down there is just more interesting, and a lot of different varieties, which you don't really have that much in the States. Of course, the food down there is different than a Mexican restaurant in the States for the most part. So check it out. There's certainly some dangers. Just be smart when you're traveling, and I think it would be totally worth it. I hope at some point I don't just even travel there. I'd love to live there for like a half year, maybe even a year in the future. So I'm looking forward to that. I hope you enjoyed this video. I had several other videos I made of my motorcycle trip and hiking up to the peak if you want to check out those videos. And after this one, I'll have many videos about Peru and Bolivia, so subscribe or check back in with me later to check out those ones, and I'll see you later.